I've got an interesting video for you guys today. It's all about how to get more cinematic footage by shooting shallow depth of field and why you need indie filters to do it. All right guys, let's unpack this in a few different ways. So first we're gonna talk about why shallow depth of field is more cinematic. If you don't understand what shallow depth of field is, it's basically the distance that's in focus in your shot. So when it's super shallow, that's when your background goes blurry and goes out of focus. Now, you can use your lens, and by changing the aperture and changing your focal length, you're gonna change how much is in focus and how much is out of focus. So what we see all the time is that cinematic footage has a very shallow depth of field. So just the object or subject in your shot is in focus, the background goes blurry, and you see this all the time in movies, you see this all the time in YouTube, on cinematic videos, because shallow depth of field is very appealing to the eye. So how do you get shallow depth of field? Well, there's a few ways, and we're gonna go through them, and I'm gonna talk about indie filters a little bit later on in the video. So the first things first, the biggest thing that affects your depth of field is your aperture. And your aperture on your camera is basically how much light your lens is letting into the sensor. So it's basically like a hose. A very, very small hose lets a little bit of light into the sensor, and a very big hose lets a ton of light into the sensor. What happens is when the hose gets bigger, so your aperture gets bigger, your depth of field will get shallow. So if you make it super small, say you're shooting at an f/16 and f/22, everything is gonna be in focus. And people use that to get awesome landscape photos and videos, because when you shoot at these higher apertures, everything is in focus and it's razor sharp and it looks really awesome. However, if you go to the other end of the spectrum and you're shooting at an f2.8 and f1.4, that's when you get that really shallow depth of field and the background goes blurry and goes out of focus. Now, the other thing that kind of affects this is your focal length. And that's because when you shoot on longer focal lengths, your background is becoming more smushed into your foreground. When I was back in film school, we would use this trick all the time, which is zoom in as far as you can, step pretty far back, and you get a more shallow depth of field because you're basically bringing the background forwards. So if you have less depth of field and you're using, like, say, a video camera that doesn't have a wide open aperture, you can get a fake shallow depth of field by using a longer lens and zooming in and stepping further back. That's a trick that we used to use in college all the time because we were using video cameras. We didn't have access to, the DSLRs and mirrorless that we have for video nowadays. However, now we have these lenses, they open up to a 2.8, they open up to a 1.4, 1.2. You have these super wide open apertures so you can get this shallow depth of field. The biggest issue that comes up though is when you want to open up to, say, a 1.4, you're letting a ton of light into your sensor. So what you're gonna have to do is bring down your ISO and turn up your shutter speed, which for photography is fine. If you do that, you can get awesome photos that are razor sharp because you're shooting at these high shutter speeds and you're getting the shallow depth of field. The issue with video is when you shoot at these high shutter speeds, that's when you get that really jittery looking footage. For video, you wanna shoot at double that of your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 30 frames a second, you wanna shoot a 1/60th shutter speed. And as soon as you start going beyond that, your footage is gonna start getting that jittery look to it. So if you don't care about that jittery look and all you care about is the shallow depth of field, then you can just turn up your shutter speed and you don't need ND filters. However, if you want something that looks professional and you want something that looks good, you want your motion blur to be correct, which is setting your shutter speed at double that of your frame rate. So you wanna keep at a 1/60th. Well, what happens is if you're shooting at a wide open aperture and you're shooting at a shutter speed that is double that of your frame rate and you're shooting at a low ISO, your image is gonna be completely blown out in the middle of the day. And that's because you're letting a ton of light into your camera. This is where ND filters come in. ND filters are basically sunglasses for your camera. And there's different strengths of ND filters. You can have them weaker if it's like a cloudy day, and you can have them stronger if you're in direct bright sunlight. I use Polar Pro's quartz filters. They are amazing. They keep the color looking perfect on all your shots, and they basically just give you that effect of having the ND filter in front. Now, there are variable ND filters out there which change strength when you twist them. However, I've noticed there's more of a color shift when you put those in front of your lens, whereas when you're using a specific ND filter that cuts out like 6 stops of light, you have a much less color change in your footage. So if you want to get good cinematic footage that has a shallow depth of field, you want to shoot wide open on your aperture, and then you want to add an ND filter so you can keep your shutter speed down to double that of your frame rate. And your ND filter is basically acting as the sunglasses so that you can shoot in these bright situations and still get the proper exposure. That's how you get this awesome looking cinematic footage on any camera. All right, so I got one last thing to talk about, and that is sensor size. If you didn't know, your sensor size has a huge effect when it comes to depth of field. So the bigger the sensor, the easier it is to get shallow depth of field. And I'm just gonna show you a little bit of math right here. Say I'm shooting on the Panasonic GH5, which has a micro four thirds sensor, which is about half the size of a full frame sensor. So what that means is that everything has to be multiplied by 2 to be equivalent to a full frame. So for example, if I'm shooting on the GH5 and I'm shooting on my 8mm lens at a 2.8, what that means in a full frame is that I would be shooting at a 16mm lens with an f-stop of 5.6. And this is the biggest issue that a lot of people don't realize, is that when you're shooting on a micro four thirds camera, your aperture is greatly affected by the sensor size. So if you're shooting on a 2.8 lens, you're actually shooting on a 5.6 lens when you make it equivalent to a full frame camera. And that's why micro four thirds footage a lot of times doesn't have that same cinematic quality that a full frame camera has. So to get that on a micro four thirds camera like the GH5, you would have to be shooting at an f-stop of 1.4 to be equivalent to a 2.8. And if you're aware, there's no zoom lenses that do that in the micro four thirds lineup. You have to get primes. And this is one of the reasons that I shoot mainly primes for almost everything I do, except for some of my vlogging stuff. And that's because the only way to get that super shallow depth of field using a micro four thirds camera is to get lenses that have more of a wide open aperture than you think. So you're talking about a 1.2, 1.4, and that's gonna be equivalent to a 2.8 in a full frame camera. Now the other way to do it is to get a speed booster, and then that will help because it increases your sensor size on a micro four thirds camera, and it also brings down your aperture in the lens itself. So there's some different ways to approach it to get that shallow depth of field, but what you need is a wide open aperture. So if you're shooting on like an f4 on a micro four thirds lens, that's equivalent to an f8 on a full frame camera, and that's why everything's in focus. So to summarize this whole talk about sensor size affecting your image, it's just something you have to be aware of. When you're shooting smaller sensors, you're gonna need to have lenses that open up much bigger than you think to get that shallow depth of field. So I suggest if you're on micro four thirds, get lenses that are a 1.4, equivalent to a 2.8, and that's how I get my footage that's super shallow and looks very cinematic. All right guys, I know that was a lot of information thrown at you in this video. If you're interested more about the details behind everything that we spoke about in this video, I do have a creator film school. I spend more time on each topic. It's something that if you're interested in filmmaking or making a career as a full-time creator, I highly suggest you check it out. Guys, if you want to see more cinematic tips on how to get awesome looking footage, check out this video up here or here. And then if you just want to see another video from my channel, check out the one somewhere around here as well. All right guys, that's it. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. A lot of awesome videos on this channel, and I think there's a lot of awesome videos on this channel that will really take your footage to the next level. All right guys, I'll see you on the next one.